Now, 1 year after the Titan submersible implosion, new information has emerged, and there is outrage over the lies told throughout the saga. In this video, I will share the latest information regarding the lies told and what actually happened during the search and supposed rescue and recovery. Viewer discretion is advised.
OceanGate Expeditions offers you the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be a specially trained crew member safely diving to the Titanic wreckage site.
OceanGate CEO Stockton Rush was either a visionary or a villain, depending on where you stand. Rush graduated from Princeton University and quickly landed a dream job with McDonnell Douglas working as a flight test engineer on the F-15 Eagle program. Afterward, he did a stint as a venture capitalist in San Francisco before teaming up with Argentine-American entrepreneur Guillermo Schoenlein to found OceanGate in 2009. Rush and Schoenlein set up shop in Everett, Washington, and began putting their dreams into action. Their plan was to take very rich customers on deep dives to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and the Gulf of Mexico in leased submersibles.
It begins with boarding day in picturesque St. John's, Newfoundland. Mission specialists meet each other in the OceanGate team.
This was actually my very first time. That was the first time that I'd been inside a sub, and it was really kind of a wonderful experience.
And you know you are in the deep, but you don't feel it.
So it's your big day.
It is my big day.
The commercial submersibles they were using weren't necessarily built for tourists, and worse yet, they were horribly expensive to lease and operate. Rush's radical solution was to design and build an all-new submersible to his own specifications. Theoretically, this would allow him and his young company to pocket more money and take their clients deeper than they had ever gone before. The only problem was that the unsinkable ship lay about 2.5 miles or 3.8 kilometers below the surface of the North Atlantic, about 3/4 of the way between Southampton, England and New York City. It goes without saying that Rush's plan was controversial. This was especially true in the relatively small marine exploration and submersible community. Some colleagues thought it was ambitious but achievable, while others were convinced that it would end in disaster. But true to form, Rush fanned the flames by revealing that he had incorporated as much carbon fiber into the design as possible. He readily admitted that this was a big departure from the norm and that he shouldn't be doing it. In his own words, he was breaking the rules. But for the brash young CEO, this seemed to be a point of pride. The general consensus among marine engineers was that even new carbon fiber of the highest quality wasn't capable of withstanding the immense pressure the craft would experience at depth. At one point, Rush told the editor-in-chief of Travel Weekly that Boeing sold him the carbon fiber on the cheap because it was too old for them to use in their airplanes. He even said that both Boeing and NASA had helped him design and test the Titan submersible. Boeing officials claimed that they had no record of any such carbon fiber sale, and that the company had never partnered with OceanGate. Nonetheless, construction of the submersible proceeded at a rapid pace, but OceanGate executives never even attempted to get their new submersible certified or even classified. Long before the Titan ever took to the water, OceanGate's director of marine operations urged the company to seek certification through the American Bureau of Shipping. This was a standard industry practice for new craft, but Rush declined on the grounds that it was unnecessary and that excessive regulation stymied innovation. At about the same time, a well-respected marine exploration specialist named Rob McCallum sent Rush an email to express his concerns. According to McCallum, Rush was risking his own life and the lives of his clients until his revolutionary new submersible was independently tested and certified. Rush responded by telling McCallum that he'd heard the same baseless claim more times than he cared to remember, and that it was really just a cheap ploy to delay or halt groundbreaking innovation. Before signing off, he said that he considered McCallum's email a personal attack. In the end, Rush wasn't so much given the green light to proceed with his brash plan, as he simply slipped through the cracks. The expedition to the RMS Titanic was scheduled for the summer of 2023. However, the conditions in the North Atlantic were so terrible that the winter and following spring launch dates were in consideration to be cancelled or postponed altogether. Thankfully, the skies had cleared and the ocean had calmed by the time the Polar Prince steamed ahead from St. John's, Newfoundland in mid-June with the Titan lashed to its deck. In addition to OceanGate CEO, Stockton Rush was the captain, and the expedition would include former French Navy officer and Titan expert Paul-Henri Nargeolet.
Experts like Commander Paul-Henri Nargeolet, leader of 30 dives to the Titanic wreck site. He and other world-class experts will be on all our missions to give you an unrivaled, up-close and personal OceanGate Titanic experience.
The sub, for me, it's very well done because it's simple. Generally, they have a lot of equipment and a lot of switch. And on this one, you don't have because you work with a screen and with a keyboard, and it's very easy to do that. You are not only a passenger seat and waiting that the time is running and just looking outside. You can do something inside. You can be really a member of the team, and that's great.
Nargeolet already had more than 36 trips to the wreck under his belt, and was widely regarded as an authority on all things Titanic. For the dive to the Titanic, he'd act as the tour guide, and for the 3 paying passengers, the first of whom was an English entrepreneur, adventurer, and aviation world record holder, Hamish Harding. The last 2 clients were a wealthy Pakistani businessman and Titanic aficionado, Shahizad Dawood, and his 19-year-old son, Suleiman. Ironically, Shahaza originally bought the second ticket for his wife, but she gave it to their son Suleiman just a week before the dive. If everything went according to plan, the descent would take about 2 hours, and the total dive time would be approximately 8 hours. Rush and his clients were brimming with enthusiasm at 9:30 a.m. on Sunday, June 18, 2023, when they climbed into the Titan, said goodbye to the Polar Prince's crew, and began their descent. As planned, Rush checked with the Polar Prince's control every 15 minutes during the early portion of the dive. All communication abruptly ceased at 11:15 a.m. Shortly thereafter, a submerged hydrophone operated by a little well-known International Nuclear Launch Monitoring Agency detected an acoustic anomaly in the vicinity of the Titanic wreck site. The Titan should have surfaced sometime between 4:30 and 5 p.m., but by 7 p.m., it was still nowhere in sight. By then, the crew hadn't had any contact with the missing submarine for nearly 8 hours, and to make matters worse, they had no idea where it was because its tracking system was apparently broken. In many respects, it was like the tiny submersible had simply ceased to exist. The first alarm bell was sounded at approximately 7:10 p.m. when Canada's Joint Rescue Coordination Centre, or JRCC, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, was called. They immediately notified the US Coast Guard and passed the information to the Navy. Surprisingly, the Navy told them they'd just gotten word that a hydrophone had detected an acoustic anomaly somewhere in their vicinity. However, the US Navy wouldn't even turn over the data to the would-be rescuers. Insiders knew that the acoustic anomaly had been detected, but neither the signature or the exact location was ever released. The phrase implosion event was branded almost immediately, but at that point, the source of the unidentified noise was still a mystery. Putting together capable search and rescue assets for such an extreme operation was no easy task. The responsibility largely fell on the shoulders of the Joint Rescue Coordination Center, Halifax commander, Chris Sim. The JRCC commander, Major Chris Sim, had decades of relevant experience, but he'd never dealt with anything like this before. He knew he'd have to find the right people and equipment and get them to where they needed to be in a fraction of the time it normally took. This would be a daunting task even if it was strictly a domestic operation. But in this case, he'd have to navigate a confusing web of national government and regulatory agencies and deal with private corporations domiciled in different countries. Chris's first order of business was finding out if the US Navy had any subs or surface ships equipped with ROVs in the area. The US Navy did have a number of ROVs capable of reaching the wreck site. But they were all deployed elsewhere, and getting them on site in a timely fashion was simply out of the question from a logistical standpoint. Even so, Chris and his team were able to secure assets from the US Air National Guard and Coast Guard, as well as the Royal Canadian Air Force and Navy. And perhaps more importantly, they scraped together a more proverbial who's who of private companies that operated the world's most advanced ships, electronics, and ROVs. One of the first commitments came from the owners of Ocean Explorer, a vessel that was financed by hedge fund guru Ray Dalio with design input from Titanic director James Cameron. Other assets that joined the effort were the French ROV Victor 6000 on board the Atlante and the MV Coco owned by Magellan. The Magellan team had tons of experience doing contract ROV work for deep sea mining companies at depths exceeding 9,800 feet or 3,000 meters. Their assistance was particularly relevant because they'd helped create the first 3D scan of the Titanic wreck years before. If the Titan had remained intact and settled on the bottom, either on or adjacent to the wreck, the Magellan crew might have been able to provide life-saving insight. In addition, British-American firm Technip FMC dispatched its vessel, Deep Energy, to the site shortly after it was notified of the situation. Its impressive array of specialized equipment included 2 ROVs designed to lay heavy-duty pipe in up to 3,000 meters of water for offshore oil and gas companies. At the time, the vessel was en route from Norway to the American state of Alabama when Captain Ross MacLeod got a frantic call telling him to change course and prepare for the most important mission he and his crew had ever embarked on. And last was the Odysseus ROV, owned by Pelagic. Odysseus was a whopping 75,000-pound, 34,000-kilogram machine with multiple cameras and stout metal arms and hands capable of doing relatively complex tasks at depth. Unfortunately, it was in pieces in upstate New York when the Titan disappeared. Nonetheless, it and its parts were crated and loaded onto overseas containers and trucked to Buffalo Niagara International Airport the same day the company owner got the call. Just hours later, the containers were loaded onto 3 U.S. Air Force C-17 cargo planes destined for St. John's on the easternmost tip of Newfoundland and Labrador. From there, they were loaded into Pelagic's ship, Horizon Arctic. Nearly all of the Pelagic crew on board Horizon Arctic knew Stockton Rush because they worked with him at OceanGate in the past. For them, the rescue mission was personal. The question was, were they already too late? By the time the 96-hour window had dwindled to just 70 hours, the close-knit submersible marine exploration community was abuzz with news of the dramatic saga unfolding 2.5 miles below the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, tens of millions of concerned viewers around the world hovered in front of their televisions, waiting for the rescue to begin. The Titan rescue plan was surprisingly straightforward, albeit unorthodox and entirely untested. When deployed, Odysseus was tethered to its launch craft via a long umbilical cord that provided power, communication, and camera footage transmission via fiber optic cables. The bundle was never intended to hoist anything more than the 23,000-pound or 10,000-kilogram Odysseus itself. Even so, Pelagic's engineers and operators felt reasonably sure that it was capable of lifting an additional 20,000 or 30,000 pounds because, like most things in their industry, it was overbuilt. After the long descent down to the Titan, the plan was for remote operators to use Odysseus's massive arms to connect a steel hook to the stricken submersible's hull. They'd also attach 2 magnetic beacons in case the connection didn't hold and they needed to relocate the Titan later on. Then, as the rising Titan passed by, they temporarily paused the ascent and attached another hook connected to a stronger cable and a more powerful winch. Once the second cable was in place, they'd resume the ascent until the Titan finally broke the surface. Nobody knew how long the first or second coupling would take. Any delay, no matter how short, would increase the likelihood that the occupants would run out of air before reaching safety. However, having 2 cables attached to the craft was imperative because, at least theoretically, they'd still have to be able to pull the Titan to the surface if one of the cables or winches failed. In addition, engineers tried to rig the winches to retract the cables more quickly than they were ever designed to do. One of the crew's greatest fears was that the Titan's frantic occupants would run out of air and perish just a few painful feet below the surface. To prevent this from happening, they brought a massive drill out onto the deck that they could use to bore a hole into the hull. If the hatches were inoperable due to damage, this drastic measure might save the lives of those trapped inside. Most of the resources didn't reach the rescue site until nearly 3 days after the Titan had disappeared. In other words, the 96-hour clock was now down to just 24 hours, and that was if the craft and the scrubbers had survived the initial event. The odds may have not been in the rescuers' favor, but if a dashing last-minute miracle was possible, they and their specialized gear were the ones that could pull it off. As such, a sense of optimism permeated the vessels. But by then, the wind had picked up, and the North Atlantic had developed a significant chop. These conditions made an already tricky operation even hairier because the captains had trouble keeping their ships in position and away from other vessels, which were all in close proximity to each other. Finally, after a few last-minute checks, Odysseus was loaded into the water over the Titan's last known position. Inside Horizon Arctic, the pelagic team used a mesmerizing array of keyboards, joysticks, and other high-tech gadgets to guide the bulky craft down through the immense column of water between it and its intended target. The descent would take at least an hour if they didn't run into any major problems along the way. At that point, the rescue had officially begun. Odysseus's cameras began broadcasting footage back to the Horizon Arctic almost immediately. By then, a few family members of those who had been on board had been flown out to the Polar Prince via helicopter. They were kept abreast of the situation as it unfolded, but they weren't permitted in the vessel's control room because nobody knew what Odysseus's cameras would capture or whether they'd have any communication with the Titan. After all, they didn't want families seeing floating corpses or hear terrified screams for help. Even if signs of life were detected, the information would have to be processed before it was passed on to them. The early portion of the descent was relatively uneventful, but Murphy's Law reared its ugly head when Odysseus ran into a strong current that threatened to derail the whole operation. Operators eventually guided the submersible through the turbulent midwater current, but unfortunately, they experienced a far more serious problem approximately 12,500 feet, 3,800 meters below the surface, when Odysseus's thrusters abruptly failed without warning. Without them, the massive ROV was an unmaneuverable hunk of steel, not unlike a submerged wrecking ball. This meant that it would be utterly useless even if it was lucky enough to emerge from the darkness right beside the Titan. The pelagic team worked frantically to remedy the situation but was unable to come up with a quick fix. As precious seconds ticked away, they made gut-wrenching decisions to reverse direction and hoist the ROV back to the surface for repairs. During the painfully slow ascent, Horizon Arctic moved out of the way so the French crew aboard the Atlante could take their place. But almost as soon as the Victor 6000 began its descent, they got word that Odysseus's arms had been fixed via remote reset. Then, once again, the two vessels switched positions. Odysseus completed its second ascent without issue, but as it neared the bottom, the monitors in the Horizon Arctic's control room revealed the last thing that any crew wanted to see. There, right before them, resting placidly on the seafloor, illuminated by the camera's stark light, was a mangled hunk of obviously new and obviously man-made debris that could only have come from the Titan. By then, millions of people around the world had become personally invested in the dramatic saga. But just hours after the debris was discovered, the US Coast Guard released a statement that left no doubt about the fate of the Titan and the 5 souls that had been on board when it disappeared 3 days before. At least to the general public, the Titan saga couldn't have possibly been more alluring or dramatic. With that being said, not everyone agreed that a rescue was ever even an option because they believed, or in some cases, knew that there had been an implosion and that the occupants had died instantly. One of the biggest skeptics of the official narrative was Titanic director James Cameron, who recently shared his thoughts on the rescue effort with 60 Minutes Australia. According to Cameron, nearly everyone who knew anything about deep-sea submersibles already knew that the craft had imploded and that the sound picked up by the distant hydrophone had been incorrectly or disingenuously labeled as an acoustic anomaly. This led to a number of questions, the first of which was why the world and the victims' families were led to believe that a rescue was even possible. To Cameron and others, the notion was nothing short of ridiculous. In fact, days before the drama ended, he wrote down the words "confirmed implosion" on a notepad while watching a news broadcast from a hotel room in Los Angeles. But on the same 60 Minutes Australia program, US Coast Guard Captain Jamie Frederick stated that there was no definite proof that there had been an implosion, only that there had been an acoustic anomaly in the vicinity of the Titan's last known location. And according to him, a rescue only becomes a recovery when tangible evidence suggests the former is no longer possible. And that's all I have for today's video, and I want to thank you for watching until the end. If this story moves you, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the next one.